My name is Bruno Waterfield. I'm the Brussels correspondent for the Times of London. That's a newspaper, and I've been a newspaper man for about 20 years. I'm in a sort of strange position working for what's often called the mainstream press, in that people in positions of authority, particularly people who work in the state or the apparatus, often accuse us of fake news. That's often a term that they use when we write something that contradicts their account, particularly when we write something that contradicts what they told us was the state of affairs. But it's not only people in positions of authority who accuse people like me of fake news. It's often people out there. So one of the big aspects of life as a journalist nowadays is all the emails you get from people accusing you of fake news, of being part of some huge conspiracy to deprive the public of the truth that actually we're ruled by lizards or whatever. I'm going to introduce our speakers in the order that they speak. First of all, here on my far left, we have Mark Johnson, who is Legal and Policy Officer for Big Brother Watch and focusing on this area of freedom of expression, technologies and policing. Then our second speaker here on my far right is Laura Dodsworth, who's a writer, photographer and author of A State of Fear, how the UK government weaponised fear during the COVID-19 pandemic. It's a very good book. Then, on my immediate left, we've got Jess Butcher, if I may, MBE. She's a tech entrepreneur, co-founder of TIC, co-founder of Blippar, and she's a commissioner on the Equality and Human Rights Commission. Last but not least, we have Professor Bill Durodié, who's Chair of Risk and Security and International Relations, as well as a former head of Department of Politics. And his area is the causes and consequences of contemporary perceptions of risk. As I said, they're all going to speak for around about 6 minutes. I'll be very strict on them, so we have plenty of time for debate. Mark.
Okay, thank you very much, Bruno. I wanted to start off on semantics because I think they are incredibly important in our area of discussion today. If you look at the terms disinformation and misinformation, you'll notice that neither lying or being wrong are actually new concepts. These old concepts have largely been replaced with much scarier new terms that really convey power to the person who is able to designate something as being false. I suppose the danger with these words is that they are used to censor. They do convey a power to the person that is able to label the information as being false. And I don't think it's any coincidence that these very politically charged terms have come to prominence during a period where our speech is more democratized than it has ever been really in human history. At this moment in time, we can communicate more freely than we've ever been able to. You or I could send a message to someone via WhatsApp, post an image on Facebook, or share a meme on whichever platform that you may choose, and someone in another part of the world can see it instantaneously. I think it's notable that once upon a time, there were real gatekeepers of speech. They were largely the media and also politicians as well. And I think it's very interesting that this discussion has come to prominence. The kind of panic about the veracity of information has come to prominence at a time when these old gatekeepers no longer control speech in the way that they once were able to. And I think it's important to note that where the media may previously have spun mistruths about gross miscarriages of justice, or where politicians fed the public falsehoods in order to enter us into illegal wars, nobody used the terms disinformation or misinformation. You will only hear them now that everybody is able to speak freely. I think the problem with these terms is that they are deeply malleable, and they're often used to discredit, censor, or suppress. But when it comes to the traditional standards that set the limitations of our speech, censoring based on veracity alone has never been considered acceptable. And there's a very good reason for that, because nobody can have a monopoly on truth, and to try to censor based purely on veracity stymies the epistemic process and the development of knowledge. You only have to look at the example of Facebook censoring the lab leak theory, which they did for a number of months at the beginning of last year. Anybody that had discussed the idea that the origins of coronavirus may not have come from a bat in a wet market in Wuhan may well have had their posts on Facebook censored or restricted, or even had their accounts limited too. And Facebook did this only up until the point where the authorities said, actually, this may be a legitimate line of inquiry. And at that point, they ceased to censor posts of that nature. And I think that it's a very important case, because it demonstrates that how thinking can move and develop, and how ideas can come to fruition. And the danger was that if Facebook had suppressed the idea, the line of inquiry may never have been established at all. One person's falsehood one day could become the truth the next. I think we also see outside of the kind of private sphere, when it comes to the state, a trend towards censorship manifesting in legislation as well. And many of you will be familiar with the Online Safety Bill, which is one of the probably most dangerous pieces of legislation to freedom of speech we've seen in this country for decades. What the Online Safety Bill does is it sees the state officially designate online platforms as our official speech police. We know that these platforms are already censoring content and acting in this manner, but this is an official state designation to do so, and indeed an obligation to do so. And this obligation actually stretches far and beyond what we consider to be unlawful speech, but actually manifestly into a new category of speech that the state designates as being harmful, even where it is expressly lawful. I think one of the most concerning things about this piece of legislation and the debate around it is that both the government and the official opposition, and indeed opposition parties in Parliament, have stated their intention to include both disinformation and misinformation. So a reminder that that is just being wrong, as a restricted category of speech, a category of speech which is entirely free, entirely lawful, but could be harmful. To my mind, I think the reality is that we do have a crisis in our society in trust, and declining trust in institutions and in our democracy itself. Some of you may have seen that there was polling recently published which showed that there was effectively a collapse in trust for democracy amongst young people, something which I think is incredibly concerning. So we have to tackle this distrust, but I think the danger is that the suppression of information and fallible fact-checking will only make this crisis in trust worse. Thank you.
Laura.
Don't be evil, proclaimed the founders of Google. They didn't set the bar high, but at least they didn't say do be evil, so we should be grateful. Since then, the Silicon Valley techno-optimists have turned into big tech oligarchs, and they wield power that is similar to nation states. Eric Schmidt, one of the Google co-founders, said that evil is whatever Sergey says is evil. He was the other co-founder. And this really highlights the problem with where we're at now, that evil is as hard to define as misinformation. All this has come to the fore now for the reasons that Mark talked about. You know, the balance of power is changing, but also technology is changing the world, and it changes who we are. So social media gives us the opportunity to shape and share our identities and political movements, and it also creates global crowds. And crowds can be dangerous, and this is very important when it comes to misinformation. It exposes us to manipulation, and it's the most sophisticated medium the world has ever known for propaganda. It's also changed the way that we consume and publish news. And yet, in some ways, the world is the same as it's ever been. We're always trying to influence each other. I'm going to try to influence you today, shamelessly. From wishing each other a nice day, to how we educate children, to how we punish criminals. We're always trying to influence. For as long as there's been information, there has been misinformation. And the delusion that we need to dispel is that there's any such thing as non-manipulative influence. The major problem with gatekeeping information is that the controllers of information are also purveyors of misinformation. Now, you know that I wrote a state of fear, and I don't want to disappoint you, so I brought some naughty government examples with me. Colonel Chris Strangle, who works in PSYOPs in the US Army's 4th PSYOP Division, said just recently that psychological operations are occurring, in quotes, literally everywhere, every day, in every component of our lives throughout the world. So let's take a look at one of the contemporary PSYOPs that's playing out in front of our eyes now. As well as conflict in the physical environment, the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine has revealed the role of media and social media in modern warfare. After the annexation of Crimea in 2014, the US and its NATO allies sent PSYOP support to Ukraine to help them build their own abilities. And Colonel Strangle, for instance, thinks that Ukraine is winning the misinformation war. PSYOPs are a form of disinformation, deliberately false information to disrupt and confuse the enemy, to boost morale, and to exaggerate military might. As you'll know, they say the first casualty in war is truth. So I wanted to just look at one example of disinformation in the war and show how it was presented in our media. In April 2022, the Ukrainian authorities dropped a real bombshell. They admitted that the ghost of Kiev was made up. That's right, he was fake news. In fact, he was a collective image of pilots, not one single fighter pilot. In fact, this origin story was fake news. The Ukrainians didn't make up the ghost of Kiev. The authorities made up the ghost of Kiev. We're constantly warned about the dangers of misinformation and disinformation. There are fact checkers, the BBC has a disinformation unit, and of course the online safety bill is constructed partly around the purpose of protecting us from disinformation. So you may be amazed to note that while the Ghost of Kiev story was floating around in the media, there were no official fact checks. There were a few articles from organisations that normally run fact checks. For example, a BBC News story about the Ghost of Kiev story was very forgiving. It explained that legends are not surprising, and there's plenty of room for embellishment. They quoted a security consultant who said that the Ghost of Kiev legend was important because in our social media age, in quotes, people need myths, heroes, and legends to provide cohesion and meaning. An Associated Press article ran a headline, Ukraine admits Ghost of Kiev fighter pilot is a myth. So myth or misinformation, lie or legend. I'm not going to pass any judgment on wartime propaganda, but this is to point out that when a group of people gatekeep truth and misinformation, they will apply political, cultural, and ideological bias. It's inevitable. And so determining what is misinformation is subjective. Also, information evolves. Mark gave some examples, so I'm going to drop mine and give myself more time. Let's go back to a historical one. Galileo was judged to be a heretic. The Catholic Church did not like his controversial theory of heliocentrism, and he was put under house arrest for his whole life. Of course, what would happen today is he would be barred from social media. He's not the only historical figure. So would Buddha, so would Plato, so would Socrates, so would Jesus. And the fact is that outliers, pioneers, creators, and disruptors are the very people who are censored and who would be barred from social media. You might have been censored without knowing it. During the COVID pandemic, Facebook admitted quite proudly that it was shadow banning people it believed guilty of sharing COVID misinformation. It might have happened to you. I know it happened to me. Google pivoted from search results, which are normally delivered based on automation, to a much more assertive intervention of deliberately pushing up information, which was based on approved content. So these policy changes reflect the facts, or at least reflect that facts and accepted facts change. If misinformation can become good information, was it ever really misinformation in the first place? Another historical example, if I told you about a secret government operation to drug people and torture them in order to control their minds, you might think this was a dangerous misinformation designed to harm the government, a conspiracy theory. Of course, it was true. The CIA approved Project MKUltra in 1953, and it carried on for 20 years. Such speculation that the government is harming its own citizens would be deemed to be harmful in a heavily regulated online safety world. Do I need to fast forward?
You need to finish now.
Oh, damn it. Okay.
20 seconds.
Fake news isn't a new problem, but it is there's a new and growing problem which is defined by the term fake news. It's impossible to define what fake news is. It's subject to bias. Our governments perpetrate it with one hand while they try to block it with the other. The legitimacy of news and information changes over time. The problem with fake news is that its function restricts permissible opinion and free-flowing information in ways that serve the powerful and the controllers of information. Ask me lots of questions later, please.
Good morning. So I don't think the battle of ideas is breaking us in gently this morning, because I certainly believe that this is perhaps the biggest issue facing our society today. Because I think it's fundamentally warping our perception of the world. It's destroying trust and it's fueling polarization. And it's undermining our values and cohesion as a society. So as Bruno mentioned, I come at this with two hats, other than the concerned citizen that's being misinformed. As a tech entrepreneur who accepts the culpability of my industry to a certain extent, and also as an EHRC commissioner who's looking at the ramifications for free speech, our human rights there, and also the impact of much of this speech on people with protected characteristics. Now, discouragingly, for all of our efforts today, hopefully within the next hour, and for all the brains that we have in this room tackling this challenge, I've been falling down these rabbit holes for much of the last 5 years looking for solutions. And I stumbled across a huge Pew Research survey of over 1,000 experts in this field. Technologists, big tech bosses, media bosses, data scientists, and rather worryingly, they were split 50-50, all 1,000 of them, between whether this could be solved or would get worse. So I thought it might be helpful context for this debate for me to summarize the arguments on both sides there and see perhaps where we fall as a room by the end of this debate. So let's start on the positive note, the optimists. So the optimists, I'm afraid to say, were actually 49%, said this. This is what they cited. Firstly, there are technology and regulatory solutions that we can put in place. Tech solutions such as content labeling, a bit like food, fact-checking, artificial intelligence and adjustment to algorithmic filters, app alerts, plugins, and perhaps trust ratings on content. Regulation, which I'm sure we'll discuss more on, both self-regulation and government regulation. With self-regulation, for example, we're seeing big tech companies put a stop already to things like flat earthism, teen girl anorexia content, anti-vax content, in English at least. But it's manual and it's one by one. And then there are armies of fact-checkers setting up news literacy campaigns, civic engagement campaigns, and of course removing fake accounts, and government regulation, so attempts by the state to try and regulate this area. They're positive that there are solutions that can assist the challenge there. They also cite that human nature comes together and will fix problems, that this is perhaps catastrophizing in the same way that all new tech is being catastrophized. Bad actors have always existed, and eventually they get marginalized by smart people and better processes. Maybe the good actors will come together, enhance our information environment. And there are indeed better content creators. Many of you will have noticed there's a hunger and a thirst for nuanced and long-form content, and some of the best podcasters actually now display proper curiosity and go deep into issues. You know, the counterculture books are selling off the shelves now. You know, people are finding sources of nuance and truth elsewhere because of the vacuum that they're seeing within their social media. We've got both sides content, things like All Sides or LetterWiki, and organizations like Tortoise, a slow news media, where they resist the temptation to jump on issues through thorough investigative work. And then there's the tech entrepreneurs, people like me looking for solutions. We've got fact checkers like Snopes, PolitiFact, BlindSpotter, BrainyTab, and FullFact. AI solutions coming into play here. And a lot of education and awareness that is really positive to make sure that people are familiar with what actually is happening and how they're being manipulated. We look at Tristan Harris's The Social Dilemma, which was hugely popular. And he set up the Centre for Humane Tech as a home for ethical techies to try and work on solutions here. And we've also got the Centre for Countering Digital Hate, the online safety tech industry, lots of smart brains applying themselves to this challenge, and a lot of narrative now around better information literacy and education within schools, so that children and indeed adults are informed about the psychops that's going on behind the scenes and start to do their own investigation and fact-checking. But how are we doing for time?
You're doing well.
The pessimists, and I'm afraid I include myself within the 51%. These are those who said it will get worse. And they start by saying that it's the fact, this is a result of the fact of the human condition. We are selfish, tribal, gullible, convenience seekers. And we put trust in the most convenient versions of the truth. And of course, manipulative actors take advantage. I love this quote that one of the experts said, "It comes down to motivation. There is no market for the truth. The public isn't motivated to seek out verified, vetted information. They are happy hearing what confirms their views." So what are the problems with some of these solutions? Well, regulation, first and foremost. I'm not a fan of the online safety bill. How, logistically, can we regulate hate across 100 billion messages a day, and that's just Facebook alone? How can we expect politicians with limited knowledge of the tech that they're seeking to control to legislate for now, let alone what's coming down the pipe? And of course, power structures often benefit from the chaos. How do we prevent regulation destroying liberties? In authoritarian states, most especially, but also dampening free speech in more liberal societies. Media literacy training, valiant effort, but no one really has the time or inclination to spend an hour going down the rabbit hole behind the sources of the information that they're consuming. And it is, of course, itself subject to bias. Typically, educational establishments lean left, so what they would deem to be misinformation might be different from who is the arbiter, basically, who is the referee of the definition of these terms. And then verified content, again, great in principle, but it's expensive to make. A minority will be able to pay for verified, reputable, reliable content, but that will only worsen the digital divide, as everybody else will be left in the chaos of the mass. In summary, as you can probably tell, I'm on the pessimistic side, although I do tune into the optimists for the sake of my mental health. The last quote I'll give you, it's from Tom Rosenthal, who's a director of the American Press Institute. "Misinformation is not like a plumbing problem you fix. It's a social condition like crime that you must constantly monitor and adjust to. Since as far back as the era of radio and before, as Winston Churchill said, a lie can go around the world before the truth gets its pants on." Thanks very much.
Thank you. Bill.
Wow, well, if being optimistic means content labeling and self-regulation, we're doomed, aren't we? I'll start as provocatively as I can. There is no problem of misinformation. And, you know, there might be a problem of people believing weird things, but then the driver for that is something completely different to information. So if you think you're going to solve it at the level of information, you're actually going to make things worse because you're going to encourage people to, in their pursuits of weird matters. That's what I'll try and explore. As with many other cases nowadays, there's a kind of knee-jerk demand for regulatory responses based on a relatively small number, I think, of extreme cases. The real problem, I think, is how we view other people. And that includes you. How do you view other people? And I think Mark touched on the problem of trust at the beginning. I'm an academic. I'm going to cite a letter sent by Academics Against Disinformation to the government of Singapore. They wrote, "We are concerned about Singapore's proposed legislation, certainly not because we are oblivious to the seriousness of the global assault on reason. On the contrary, academics are at the front lines of this battle." Well, I am an academic, and I can tell you, indeed, they are at the front line of this battle, but usually on the wrong side. Because you can't defend reason if you don't pursue truth. And more than any other occupation, I think, in the last 50 years, academics have made it their pursuit to suggest that there are no truths, that everything is contingent, contextual, cultural, or even individual truths. And unsurprisingly, they've become some of the greatest proponents of fact-checking. There's a long history of misinformation. I won't go into that from the Trojan horse onwards. It's nothing new, but undoubtedly 2016 was a watershed moment with the Brexit vote in this country and the election of Trump. Fact-checking actually started a bit earlier. 2003, Fact Checker came out of the University of Pennsylvania, and I suggest that shows already a growing sense of insecurity amongst the elites in the aftermath of 9/11. But the real driver was the perceived rise of populism, driven by, we're told, people's prejudices. And the claim is that new technology provides people with greater ease, greater speed, greater access, and greater impact, although all the research I've seen done on the impact suggests that that's fairly ambiguous. It's initially framed as an American and British problem for understandable reasons, but others were the first to regulate, usually using the British and American examples to create a sense of alarm in their countries. So NetzDG, or the Network Enforcement Act in Germany, came in by January 2018, and notably used the word fake throughout its language to suggest that this was a novel and foreign problem. France introduced a law in 2018 focusing on elections, and the trajectory gradually moved from hate speech to the effects of mistruths on democracy, and invariably Russia lurked in the background. Even with Trump, Russia lurked in the background. So the argument, there's a shift from truth to social stability, which is quite important to note. And it affects every area of life, from health to science, education, finance, security. Using metaphors of war and disease, it's become this all-consuming discourse that you've all heard about, and yet I say there is no problem of misinformation. In Singapore, a country I know a little bit about, they had a select committee on deliberate online falsehoods, which I urge you all to watch the committee hearings. They're pretty amazing. They were held in March 2018. The Home Office minister said that other countries are seeking to weaken Singapore through a disinformation campaign, and famously noted, democracy itself is under serious threat. Well, if you know Singapore, that's a big issue. And then, quote, "You've seen what happens in the US, you've seen what happens in the UK, the center gets hollowed out." It's a very interesting quote, actually. And they set up a website called Factually that you should also all go away and look at, which is a government fact checker which demands that posts are corrected or taken down rather than encouraging dispute or clarification. I can give you countless examples, I won't have time, but just to show you the micromanagement level that is obviously part of the Singaporean mindset, we have here the correction of falsehood regarding a woman who claimed to need urgent financial help but had no one to turn to. On the 24th of April 2022, Gilbert Goh published a Facebook post featuring an appeal he purportedly received from Madame A, who claimed she had no one to turn to in need of financial assistance, blah, blah, blah. And then there's three massive paragraphs from the Singapore government noting A, that she receives support already, B, that she receives other assistance, C, that she hasn't asked for any more, D, that this creates a false impression, and then encouraging people, if they need support, providing contact details. If that's the direction you want to go in, go for it. Notably, of the about 100 cases so far that have been processed through the Singapore processes, half of them relate to COVID. And at the end of every single COVID misinformation post, they say, "We advise members of the public not to speculate." Don't ever speculate, yeah? And to refer to credible sources of information. most of their work basically targets opposition parties and opposition individuals. All of the statements that have been scrutinized related to government institutions or officials, government policies, or the government's handling of COVID. But the big point I want to make here is that it's not fear, even though I specialize in fear, it's not fear that's the real consequence of this. The real consequence is flooding and friction. By flooding, I mean that they flood the information space with the official narrative. Yeah, you're asked to take down, you have to post the official narrative. That enhances the prominence of that. And by friction, I mean it becomes harder to criticize. The entry price for criticism becomes more challenging, and worse, the government slows down in its provision of information. If you can only cite government information, there's no interest in them in being responsive to that. Very final point I want to make is that intelligence, both in the military sense and I suspect the biological sense, is a combination of both information and how you interpret that information. That's the key here. Yeah? Hans Blix went to look for evidence that there was weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. He provided information to the effect that there wasn't, but how that was interpreted is a different matter. If your mental framework is you can't trust Saddam and they're bloody good at hiding things, then that is the framework that determines how you view information. Got a whole lot more, which I'll come back to in the responses about trusting people and the importance of contestation in order to clarify things, and how that's a good thing. We should thrive on falsehoods. We need more of them because it makes your mental muscles work and it creates a public debate.
Right, we're coming straight out to the audience.
I just want to add a layer within the discussion, and especially with the last speaker as well, and that's the area of personal psychology and mental health. We're actually in an age of information obesity. It's not the fact that there's poor information or bad information, it's the fact that people are obsessed about news and information. I think it was, Kevin Kelly, the guy who created Wired magazine, and he famously said the problem of the future will not be that we can't connect. It will be that we cannot disconnect. And I see it with young people I work with executives I work with. People are so anxious and so stressed. And I have to say, a lot of it is the obsession with information, the obsession with news. I'm a reasonably middle-aged guy. I don't remember being this obsessed with news and information when I was in my 20s. 86% of graduates at the moment have mental health problems. 86%. And I have to say, I do think it's this obsession with news, information, social media, and there is a layer within this, and some of the people on the panel perhaps have contribute to this with the obsession with information. I don't think it's, when we come to things like mindfulness, it's getting rid of information, detoxing from the news, not saying I've got to read more news. That was my only thought.
Thank you very much. The name's Ewan Grant. I'm a former UK law enforcement intelligence analyst who's worked for European Union programs in Ukraine, which is why I urge everybody in this room, whether they like the message or not, to read Mr. Waterfield's article this week on Joseph Borrell's speech to the diplomats. I also taught in training courses in the UK the John F. Kennedy case, so I'm used to people swallowing conspiracy theory nonsense, and it is nonsense. My question to you all is, what role do the schools and the parents of teenage children have in tackling this very real problem? And I realize, to say the least, the schools are overstretched. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here, and I'm also an academic, someone who's been worried about these topics for quite some time, and I'm also one who's trying to work on a technological solution. That's my little plug. If you're interested, please come to talk to me. But I also would like to say that I'm, as a constructive criticism, I'm a little disappointed by this debate, this first debate, because we all seem to be, with one possible partial exception, on the same side of the debate here. We're all critical and concerned about how this idea of misinformation and fake news is being used, or rather misused. So here's my question to the panel, which is, could each one of you steelman the argument in favor of what the elites and big tech controls are doing?
Good question. You please.
How positive are you about Elon Musk's proposed takeover of Twitter on free speech?
Ooh, okay. I'd like to bring panel back, particularly on that question. Those two questions, but particularly on that question raised by your academic colleague, Bill. Who would like to come back in?
I'm not sure I understood the question. Argue in favour of big tech controls, wasn't it? I'll just give you an anecdote, which, Nicole Wong, who was the vice president of Google, was sent 2 videos of the hanging of Saddam Hussein. And she had to decide pretty quickly what Google would, and YouTube would do about that. And they decided that they would show the video that showed his actual hanging, but they had received one that just showed his dead body. And she argues that showing the hanging is important for the historical record, but that the dead body is gratuitous. She then goes on to say on camera, I have no idea whether we made the right decision. I mean, the important part, as I'm sure we all know, is who gave big tech authority to determine what the historical record was going to be in the first place. There are plenty of gratuitous images of war and violence. If we want to protect and infantilize ourselves from them at all times, then we're going to live in a bizarre world. That's all I'll say.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I'll say one thing. I can't really argue in favour in the way that you'd want. I just can't. But I'll say one thing. The big tech platforms and social media platforms are all using algorithms. And I think algorithms are the black box where free speech and democracy go to die. So I think that if algorithms are going to be deployed to control information, and you have to remember, when you're online, it's not a neutral platform. There is nothing neutral about it. It's designed to be personalised to you. If they're going to use algorithms, then I think they should be declared, like health warnings. So we have this ridiculous law now in this country where menus show you calorie counts, and if you buy food, it's going to have all the ingredients in. If you buy cigarettes, they have to show you a picture of some blackened lungs with a health warning. So I think that all of these platforms should have to declare what their algorithms do in a simplistic language, in a way that's very easily flagged up for an ordinary consumer to understand. And I think they should have to publish the secret source as well. I don't think it should be proprietary and secret, so that people can understand if they want to be influenced, controlled, censored, and have information prioritised and deprioritised at the will of the platform.
Can I ask a quick question to Laura on that?
Go for it.
But, I mean, there are lists of ingredients on every product at the supermarket. Only real weirdos read the lists of ingredients. And quite honestly, I did my very first research paper was on one softening agent adding to PVC called esters of oxalic acids. But anyway, you've got to be a nerd to read the literature that's available on that. So no one's going to do that. There's real life to live.
No, but
Yes.
that's
and of
why I
course,
think there should
knowing
be
the ingredients doesn't teach you how to cook.
But I think there should be a consumer version and then the full tech version. I think it's really important for people to understand how the environment that they're so immersed in is being controlled and manipulated. I think there was a question earlier as well about news, the fact that we're very saturated in news and it's bad for mental health. And it would tie into that. About half of people in the UK and the US use Facebook and social media for news, and about 1/3 of people rely on Facebook for their news. So that's why we all feel like we're saturated in news, and it is quite bad for mental health. I've woken up today feeling like I've got a hangover, which is really unfair because I didn't drink anything yesterday. What I've got is politics. I've woken up with having looked at the news too late last night. And that's the problem, because we go onto social media for social things, and we're constantly getting news of certain sorts pushed upwards.
Okay, Mark.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on exactly the same point about too much news, because I do sympathise with that. And I think perhaps to reframe it slightly, I don't necessarily think it's too much news per se, but too much sensationalism. And one of my great frustrations with this debate, and indeed with the debate around the online safety bill, is that the discussion around regulation and content moderation comes at the very end of the process. It's all about controlling speech and limiting speech. But if you look at the platform's business models, they promote sensation in order to keep people on the platforms and then sell more ads to those, direct more ads to those people. And I really, really wish that we could actually, as Laura already spoke about, have a look at the kind of the back end of the process, the platform's business models, actually try and limit the amount of mass data collection that drives that model, rather than get into the territory of speech policing, because you get into the whole kind of like rights minefield at that point.
Jess, do you want to add?
Yeah, I was confused about the straw manning questions. I'm not sure what we're straw manning. Are we saying this isn't a problem, or that the tech companies aren't responsible for it?
Steel manning.
Steel manning,
It's
sorry.
the best argument in favour of censorship.
In favour of censorship. Oh.
Hold that thought then. Hold that thought then.
Social stability.
Hold that thought. But is it really, you know, is really the social stability the be-all and end-all of the pursuit of truth? I think the idea that the social stability and truth are one and the same is a pretty bizarre concept when you look through the history of the last 150 years. Very, very strange. A very, very strange notion. Come on, hands up, please.
When fact-checkers and the people who believe in fact-checking say that something should be removed from a platform like Facebook or YouTube because of its inaccurate factual content, they're appealing to a kind of naive epistemological relativism, which you yourself, Bill, earlier pointed out they don't believe in. They think facts are context-dependent. They depend upon a kind of hierarchy of knowledge and who the gatekeepers are and the rest of it. And the people involved in fact-checking, including, I imagine, in some cases, the fact-checkers themselves, seem to be appealing to the authority of factfulness, which they themselves don't believe in. I mean, is it just bad faith, hypocrisy? Is it a form of rhetoric to actually advance a particular political agenda? Or is it cognitive dissonance? Are they not aware of the disconnect between the authority they're appealing to and their own skepticism about the authority of facts?
I have a quick question. I think it's the elephant in the room. Will the Alex Jones case set a precedent of accountability for big tech and the corporate media?
Good question. There, please.
Thank you. I grew up in censorship myself. Where I grew up, there was a huge censorship, and it's always in the name of a greater good. And it was kind of scary to see that one cabinet minister coming and talking that, yeah, I have to protect children, in a way giving you guilt trip, that if you are against this, you want children to be harmed. You are, in a way, in the same league of pedophiles and child abusers and so on. And that is very scary to me. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much for the discussion. My name's Tara McCormack. I just wanted to say that I think the real problem is not crazy Facebook posts or, Twitter, people arguing that, COVID vaccines are about making all women infertile. But actually, that the mainstream media, from the BBC to the Times, sorry, Bruno, is 90% now about not informing or even arguing, but essentially about, as the journalist Leighton Woodward has called it, creating a consensus. And that is the profound problem. And most of this is simply channeling at government narratives, as we know, whether it's foreign policy, the good lie rules in terms of coverage of Ukraine, or COVID. And I think actually COVID coverage was kind of the foreign policy model come home. So I think that's where the real problem lies, that our governments mistrust us so much that all they seek to do at the moment is to kind of manage our emotions.
Yes, but surely that's something that's been around for quite a long time, and I'm not revealing any great matters of import when I tell you that the Times of London, which has been around for a couple of 100 years, has tended to, on the whole, seek to pull a consensus around the establishment, particularly at election times. So I think we need to look to interrogate this a bit more, to ask ourselves questions like, why is it that most people agree that the QAnon conspiracy theory about paedophiles is a load of rubbish and quite dangerous and to be rebutted, But why is it that a similar theory about paedophiles in the establishment put forward by Tom Watson, who was deputy leader of the Labour Party, who's now going to become a peer, but that was considered decent coin, and in fact there was a police investigation around it too. Why is it that we seem to be so subject to these conspiracy theories, and why is it that the establishment itself, which Tara quite rightly points to, have always had an interest, a long-established one, in controlling information to preserve ideology or to preserve their relative political position? Why is it that even they are subject to these problems and trends? Right, hands up, please. You speak. Hands up.
Without history, news is meaningless. So following on from your point, yes, I'd like to hear more of two sides. So with the war in Ukraine, I'd like to hear more about the history and from Russia's point of view, what it's doing. And Tim Marshall, I think, provides some amazing context going back in history for 2,000 years. The other quick point I just wanted to make is I am a New Zealander and I was part of some anti-mandate protests in Wellington. And what shocked me was that the mainstream media not just didn't report what was going on, they actually lied about it. And I'm puzzled because I do believe our media is independent. But I'm puzzled as to why so much of media seems to actively lie. And I was there, and what the media, the Dominion in New Zealand told was an absolute lie on what was actually happening. Why is that?
Yeah, so in terms of this conversation, it seems like there's always two views towards social media. They're either, say, a platform that needs to be, controlled through legislation in one of two ways. Either they need to be enforced to allow everyone of every view to speak their mind, and no algorithms allowed to be used to be able to prioritize content or anything, or they've got to be used to do the exact opposite. The social media companies need to be controlled in a different way to control what news is spread around or what information is spread around. But I think that one position that's left out, it's a false alternative there. The one position that's left out is that, these social media companies are set up, say, by individuals for a purpose in mind. They either want to, they may have a purpose of, open discussion, everyone can speak their mind, or they may say, oh, we want, pleasant interactions, people want to come to the platform and, either not be harassed, or they don't want to see news at all, maybe. So I think that instead of looking at these social media companies as things to control, they should just be seen as, oh, these are people at this company that have a goal in mind and shouldn't be controlled, but allowed to fulfill their purpose for their company. And, let's say flat earthers are not allowed on, say, one social media company. There's always other places like, say, specific forums that want to always talk about this, those ideas, and they're able to go on to another place.
Yep.
Hello. Just wondering if any of you can give a recent historical account of the origins of the term fake news.
Good question. Right, Jess, give the microphone to that chap there, but we're going to come back again a little bit. Jess, you're going to come back on the Alex Jones.
Yeah, I thought the Alex Jones question was an interesting one because that case has kind of highlighted the risks of just proper lying in the public square in the debate, and he's been held accountable for that. And I think there's a lot of conflation and confusion, particularly around the online safety bill, about how far it's addressing things that are already covered in law. Libel is covered in law. Certain types of content are already illegal. Content that is targeted at children, that is just factually, wrong and proven to be wrong. We conflate everything within a law that, talks about legal but harmful. And we simply can't police that because harmful, as we've discussed, is in the eye of the beholder. And yet, when things are demonstrably proven false, that is libel. And there is so much that the online safety bill is seeking to do that actually is covered by law. The challenge that we have is that there's so much of it, there simply isn't the resource and the manpower, except in high-profile cases such as Alex Jones, to police this stuff. And because there's so much conflation of what is harmful or perceived to be misinformation or disinformation, we get subjective comments. It's whoever shouts loudest is the argument that then gets picked up by the media, or indeed the police get waded into things where it's much more subjective and not as clear-cut. So I think that's the narrative around these things is what's driving the response to it, and we need to fall back on the laws we already have, the Equalities Act, the libel laws, in order to better police, but we simply don't have the resourcing given the amount of content that's out there.
And surely as well, common sense. I mean, if you look at Alex Jones, did he really piss in the pot or poison public life? And more his opinions about actors, Sandy Hook and all the rest of it, gratuitously offensive for families that lost their children and all the rest of it. The more they were amplified, the more marginal he became, the more people actually took the decision, this is offensive crap, and the more the people who cling on to that, who have their own reasons for clinging to that, become more and more marginal and insane in peering Bill.
Well, first of all, I just want to wind up my panel a bit more. I don't think social media is the greatest propaganda tool ever. The research I've read, which is limited, I guess, suggests only about 14% of people get all their news from social media. We know that social media is largely derivative of mainstream media. You post, oh, look, have you seen this thing in The Guardian or The Times or whatever? There's no great evidence that it's necessarily as effective as people might imagine. And actually, there's some suggestion that it encourages people to look at other media, rather than, there's all that discussion about we live in media bubbles. That's disputed as well out there, by the way. I don't know why there's all this mental health concern. I mean, I do, I guess. But, I don't view it as there's too much news. I mean, so one key point to make, surely, is that the news quality is shoddy. And, aside from academics, journalism has given up on the pursuit of truth. And when journalists do that, then, of course, there's this kind of plethora of the kind of opinion sphere that emerges. I just wanted to really pick up on Toby's point. So, fact checkers what don't believe their own facts. Well, I think what we've got is, there's one rule for them, another for us. But I don't view it solely as a form of hypocrisy. They quite clearly are partial. They take sides in these debates. But they do treat the masses as, infants who need to be managed, and they're smart enough to see through these things, just as those who develop the prevent duty for counterterrorism think of themselves as capable of reading jihadist literature, but everybody else is perfectly incapable. And on that point, I'll finish with the chap behind who mentioned child safety. That was kind of my point at the beginning about they pick on extreme examples. Well, obviously, you can't get more extreme than the Molly Russell case in the media at the moment, girl who committed suicide, purportedly because she looked at all these awful websites. But the reality of life is this. People's lives are much more complicated than just what they see online. And you and I don't know what was going on in Molly's life behind the scenes. We don't know all the other factors and influences upon her life, including narratives of death and doom that are dominant in contemporary culture. We know that no single influence leads someone to taking such a terrible decision. And it's a mistake to think that must lead to censorship, just as in the same way that, kids who are purportedly encouraged by social media into terrorism, that's not the case. It falls on fertile ground, and you need to ask what made that ground so fertile before they saw that information. That's the deeper cultural framing that you need to challenge, rather than get obsessed with the misinformation that will end up treating us all as babies.
Just on that though, Bill, I mean, one of the things that came up in the Molly Russell sort of judicial process, I think the inquest, were her parents saying that they were unable to get access to her Facebook account. They were unable to see what it was she was actually feeling. She was 14. I think. Do you think it's fair enough for parents, adults, the guardians of children should be able to, in a case where there is an alleged harm or alleged behaviours that are inappropriate or causing harm, grooming, for example, do you think there's a case for parents being able to have access to those accounts and that information?
I suspect the problem starts before that, with parental authority and the relationship between the parents and the child. My usual joke is I've told my kids that their first mobile phone will be the one they buy with their first pay packet, so you can tell which side of that I'm on.
Can I come
Yes,
back?
do.
Okay, so I'd like to come back to Bill on what he was saying about propaganda and also on the issue of child safety. So, I mean, I think, you could argue till the cows come home about whether social media is a new and dangerous tool for propaganda. But let me just give you a couple of examples. No one really has a handle on how many bots there are on Twitter, for instance. But just last month, the Washington Post reported that the Pentagon's ordered an audit of how the US military is actually running fake personas and accounts and bot campaigns. So anonymous officials have pointed the finger at the US military for this, and I think 150 accounts have been closed down. So some of the posts involve anti-Russia narratives. Some of the posts were countering disinformation spread by China about COVID-19. And one fake account was talking about organ harvesting in Afghanistan. So if those accounts are true, then they're violations of doctrine and training practices of the US military. So there's investigations there in the US. I mean, also here in the UK, this isn't really new. In 2016, Google announced 2 anti-radicalization programs. One was to make sure that counter-narrative videos would be more discoverable on YouTube, and the other was to make sure that when people were searching for potentially harmful and damaging terms, that those counter-narratives would come up. So to flesh out what that means in practice, if you've got an internet user who fits the profile of an impressionable young Muslim, as Prevent would define it, and then they search for terms such as Syrian war in Google, Google would deliberately refer them to the Open Your Eyes, ISIS Lies campaign, which was created by Breakthrough, an agency that was employed by the Research Information Communication Unit in the government. So, you may say the ends justify the means, but what you have there is a young person looking for one form of propaganda and being given another form of propaganda. And actually, the internet is now rife with this, which was the point I was trying to make. But I packed my talk into so much information, I didn't even get through it all. I'm so sorry. It's my politics hangover. Right.
Hang on. In fact, it's not so much counter-narratives that we need as knowing what our narrative is. That's the fundamental flaw behind all this Prevent stuff.
I just want to make the point, there's a lot of propaganda on social media, and I actually think this confluence of algorithm and nudge is a new thing. On child safety, I thought that was a really interesting point because the case of Molly, is it Russell? Yeah. I mean, that's not alone. There are actually multiple lawsuits against Meta in the US for alleged harm caused to young people. There's one mother in the US that's suing Meta over claims that her daughter became addicted to Facebook and then developed self-harm and an eating disorder. Now, Facebook does stipulate that users should be 13, but they don't say anywhere that their platform is clinically addictive. The problem is that I think these cases, I don't know if I heard rumblings there about clinically addictive. Again, we could argue about that all day. But the thing is that these particular cases of young people are probably being weaponised to a degree in order to promote the idea that social media needs more control in order to further online safety bills, which aren't just here in the UK, but seem to be happening almost simultaneously in the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the EU, Ireland, everywhere, amazingly, all at the same time. Oh, okay, all right, so just finishing on child safety, the issue is that Instagram and Facebook are built upon insecurity. I think that Instagram's slogan is capture and share the world's moment, but it might as well be show off about your latest outfit, or you're not really doing yoga unless you've storied it. And unless you legislate for insecurity and showing off, you can't fix the problem, which is why I would say that the platforms instead should just be really transparent about their algorithms. And then the question earlier... No, you don't want to come back on another point?
You can come back another point. But surely your point you've just made, which is very, very important, deals with this thing here, is actually a lot of teenagers aren't actually looking at news on Telegram or news on Twitter. They're looking at themselves and their peer groups on Instagram or on Facebook, and it's intensely narcissistic. It's about their tummies or their bottoms or what clothes they're wearing or their piercings. Mark, stick your hands up, by the way, if you want to.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on a point, actually, that you made, which I thought was very interesting, which is, the considered acceptability of different conspiracy theories. I mean, I think that's a fascinating consideration unto itself, the difference between, the kind of QAnon conspiracy theory, which is clearly, deeply problematic and concerning, but also, the idea that a politician in the UK could propagate such a similar theory, and for it to kind of almost go under the radar. But I think we could also take a step back, even further than that, which is to consider, perhaps if we are being empathetic, why is it that we do live in an environment where conspiracy theories can thrive? I mean, I couldn't tell you empirically if conspiracy theories are on the rise or not. But I do think that rather than just seek to censor or suppress ideas, is there anything that we could do to create a more open and transparent environment in which conspiracy theories do not have any darkness, in which they can grow? And I think that the state has a role in that. If you're a journalist or a researcher and you try to submit a freedom of information request, I think the more likely outcome that you'll get is that you will not receive the information that you initially requested. It's becoming increasingly harder. The government are increasingly not transparent, and it's not just issues of national security or public health, but it's in all sorts of areas where they will not disclose activities when you are trying to find out what they're up to. So I think if we can in any way be empathetic and not just seek to censor and suppress, it's absolutely vital that we try and target the lack of transparency in government and in our institutions, which actually creates an environment in which conspiracy theories can thrive.
I just wanted to offer another context in which we can consider this whole issue of misinformation, and that is the immense benefit that we get from social media. And I think sometimes we discuss this issue like social media is all bad. I just needed to get some information before I came here, which would have taken me hours and maybe books, going to the library. But I just typed it on YouTube and I got the information in 3 minutes. So the whole issue of misinformation, I think, is ignoring the immense benefit and the great leap forward that we've experienced by having access to this tool. And that's just a comment. And I think my question is there any research out there to show that people are any more misled or gullible than they ever were? Because a lot of this, the claims that are being made today, I don't know if there's any baselines for which we judge these things. There seems to be just an assumption that it's all bad and people are being so misled. And I don't know if we're just talking about the same old 5% of people who will always be misled.
As the arbiters of what students are taught and what they aren't, how much of a role do universities and university lecturers play in dictating the misinformation agenda, which is what constitutes misinformation and what doesn't?
I just wanted to make a point about the stupidity of misinformation and disinformation. We only talk about it in relation to the information that exists. We don't have anything to say about the information that is not there, the articles that the BBC chooses not to write or to put up. We only talk about the stuff that is there. The other thing I would say is I would challenge anyone to define hate speech. I think that swearers and I hate swearers and litterers, and I hate people who listen to music on the train. But those are legitimate forms of hatred, I would suggest.
Can you pass the microphone in front of you to the gent who's got his hand up? And yes, please.
So first, it's an observation. I agree with the first point being made by the person from Big Brother's Watch. The fact of the matter is, I believe it's that person, the fact of the matter is there's way too much information that is being displayed. It's a democratization of information and messaging for any one person to have the knowledge or the time to fully go down the rabbit hole to verify within their own frame of context to evaluate it. That's just an observation. I agree with that point. The question I have is we've been talking about misinformation in a broad sense. The reality is we have things like commercial interests. These are the social media companies. We have traditional news journalism, media companies, and we have government. We've been talking about them in some ways in an equitable fashion, an equal fashion. The question I guess I'd propose to you is, should we be doing that? Should we not be evaluating differently? Commercial interests are commercial interests. I agree with the transparency that Laura's been discussing. What about news organizations? Historically, they've had protections. Should there be a heightened impetus on them to ensure that they're communicating objectively? And then you have people in authority. You have government. What should be the ramifications for demonstrative misinformation, misrepresentation of facts, like lying? Should they be held to a different bar? Would be a question I'd pose.
Yeah, so one of the things that I've been intrigued in this discussion so far is that question of news and the question of anxiety and overloaded with news. But I think Bill Durodié's point about information and how we interpret it, or whether we're interested in that particular information or not, is perhaps more important, and how it relates to us as a society and a culture. Because I've been really struck that where young people may be anxious about all sorts of things, they're completely relaxed about the Ukraine war. They're not particularly interested in the Ukraine war. They're not anxious about key warnings about the dangers of escalation of the war and it becoming a nuclear war. They don't feel the same anxiety that people might have felt in the 1960s over the Cuban Missile Crisis or in the 1980s. They're not the same generation that were worried about the Vietnam War because they might be drafted. So I think it's useful to look at what's happening in society and the relationship of society to news.
So I wanted to ask the panel what they think about two things that have happened this week, which appear to me to show a double standard in the whole idea of censorship and censorship of so-called misinformation. The first thing I wanted to talk about was a spokesperson for Pfizer who admitted this week that in spite of the fact that their experimental injections against COVID were pushed onto millions of people all over the world on the basis that they prevented transmission and infection of this virus, in spite of that, the fact that they said that, this spokesperson admitted this week that they hadn't actually checked that it wasn't based on any evidence whatsoever. Therefore, this person was admitting that they had spread misinformation. During the same week, a very eminent cardiologist called Dr. Aseem Malhotra published a peer-reviewed paper in which he showed, in a very measured way, some of the harms, the unprecedented harms that have come to certain people as a result of this vaccine, which most of us were coerced into taking. He himself had taken it and now regretted having taken it. Now, my question is, he, Aseem Malhotra, was immediately taken down from Facebook and banned for misinformation, whereas the Pfizer spokesperson, who admitted spreading misinformation, to the best of my knowledge, hasn't been. So I'd like to know what the panel thinks about that.
Okay, I've got views on that, but we'll keep myself to myself. Gentleman there, please, in the check shirt.
Yeah, sorry to be the one to raise the spectre of Alex Jones again, but I just wanted to make a question, or make a point / ask a question about trust. I think I'm safe in assuming that everybody in this room and everybody we know, insofar as we were aware of it at all, finds his comments on Sandy Hook repulsive. But there seems to be something very out of hand in the punishment that was meted out to him. And I think that stems from where a lot of the discussion about disinformation and misinformation stems from, and that is trust in people to actually be able to decide these things for themselves. How do we go about restoring that? That might address the issue of not needing to worry whether people think about conspiracy theories or not, because we've all been in situations where our eyes have glazed over in the pub as somebody is talking about the moon landings being fake and all that. This is an old hat. So I think a little bit more shared trust is probably something that needs to be discussed.
Hi, I just want to make a quick comment on young people and their attitude to misinformation. There's various surveys that show that millennials and Gen Z are more in favour of censorship and more prone to try and censor views they disagree with. And it's often presented as an issue of arrogance, like they're so wrapped up in their own view that they can't take other people disagreeing with them. And I think it's a bit more complicated than that. I think it's an issue of education. So there's a 6-year gap between me and my youngest sister. And I remember at school being taught about free speech and about Stalin and the kind of Soviet control of information. And she was just quite simply, for whatever reason, not taught about those things. And I think having grown up in such a moderate age, it's not natural that you would truly understand why freedom of speech is so important unless somebody explicitly made that case to you. So if you were told that certain information was dangerous and you don't know why that idea in itself is dangerous, you're kind of going to go along with it and be thinking that you're doing the right thing. So I think in terms of making this point to young people, it would be helpful if the tone was less accusatory and more keen to actually educate on why these things are important.
My question to the panel is, should social media apps, companies such as Facebook, Snapchat, Twitter, prioritize responsibility towards its shareholders or the consumers? Because, of course, when they prioritize responsibility towards shareholders, they have a profit-maximizing motive, and they have to promote their brands in unethical ways, which means that consumers would be harmed. But then if they're prioritizing the consumers, their profits would go down because, of course, their shareholders will not get enough dividends through more ethical ways. So would you say that which one should they prioritize? And my second question is, should consumers take personal responsibility for using these social media apps and the negative consequences that come with it? Or should the apps themselves, they should take responsibility? Because, of course, for example, Snapchat, they'll send notifications which will urge us young people to open the apps. But should we be the ones to take responsibility, or should the apps, the companies, be the ones to take responsibility?
So hang on, what do you think? Do you think you should take a bit of responsibility on Snapchat, or what?
Because they do send us these notifications. We may not be using the app, and then there'll be someone posted something, or they will send these notifications when you're not using the app. But I think it depends on how the person is.
Thank you. I just want to make an observation about the fact that all the things you're talking about are, very interesting and good to listen to, but it's very theoretical, and I keep coming back to the fact that misinformation does have real-world effects on actual people. And to take coronavirus, for instance, there was a theory that it came from China. I mean, ultimately it did come from China, but over here I think the first coronavirus case came from somebody who went skiing in Italy. And I come from a Chinese heritage background, so a lot of my community, just walking down the street, were abused and in some cases physically attacked, and people had their homes firebombed. And going back to Alex Jones and Sandy Hook, I mean, it's all very well to say, he's got his comeuppance now, but at least one of those parents killed themselves because of the abuse. So for all the stuff that we're talking about, which I think is incredibly important, there's real world events, there's actual people who die because of this. And the interim period where you're trying to find redress or even just, get the facts out there means that there are bodies in the wake of that. So, thanks. Okay.
So I'd like to ask about sort of hypothetical that in the next few years might not be hypothetical. I was lucky enough to be born after one of the UK's biggest acts of open censorship and it was in a lot of your lifetimes, Section 28. But there are talks of bringing a version back, as part of the whole moral panic surrounding trans people and all other queer people. And how does the panel think that that would be practiced in the modern day with the internet?
I just want to say something very, very quickly on the facts, because as part of this debate, everyone should read a brilliant essay, well, it's a great book, Between Past and Future by Hannah Arendt, and there's a chapter in it called On Truth and Politics, and she makes a point in terms of our political attitude towards facts, that there's a danger of quotes taking them as the results of some necessary development which men could not prevent and about which they can do nothing. What she's saying is there's a real temptation quite often to take social stability, social institutions, the way things are, and just present that as a fact, something that happened of necessity and which we can't do anything about. Right, to our speakers, Bill.
Okay, obviously I can't answer it all. What role do universities play in this? Well, look, 90% of academics voted Remain. That makes them monoversities in my book, not universities. You draw the conclusion. Fantastic point from the person here. Misinformation has real effects, yeah? But controlling misinformation in the wrong way, or controlling information, will have even bigger effects. And, communities have suffered throughout history. The ones that have been successful are the ones who have sorted out the problems for themselves, not looked to someone else to regulate behavior and censor other people. That may have marginal benefits at a particular moment in time, but I think it leads ultimately to a patronizing relationship, subjugating your agency and diminishing your potential. Very quickly, my main point is this. We're not suffering from wicked myths projected into the public space from outside. We're suffering from a corrosion of reason in the public space from the inside. That's where the problem is, and if you don't start addressing that, you're never going to start addressing it. The problem is the declining moral authority of the political class, academics, and the media. They've abandoned objectivity for other targets, lost their legitimacy, and opened the door. They opened the door to a free-for-all on facts. Then they have the gall to demean the demos, blame us for believing those facts, and impose censorship as their solution upon us. The only positive note is that it demands that we use our own mental and moral muscles and decide for ourselves what is right. They abandoned being gatekeepers. We have to assume the responsibility. Very final point. Rather than providing children with misinformation education, I can't think of anything worse, right? Get them to read literature, history, and even the classics. They might learn about the human condition.
Yes, so much to unpack and so many different comments here. I think the issues that I tune into the most are around the sort of mental health ramifications. And I think there's the conflation of two sort of psychological economies that's happening here. Firstly, the attention economy, and we've had quite a lot of questions around the business model of media and content online and how far that's exacerbating that, because of course it does lead to clickbait, short-form content, and outrage is ultimately what fuels the attention economy. But concurrently with that, I think we have a doom economy, because it's bad news that sells. And we give it much, much more weight. We talk a lot about post-traumatic stress, and yet post-traumatic growth is actually 4 times more common than PST. And we just don't talk about positives within society or progress. So I think where we come to is that, yes, we could censor. If we get the big tech to censor more, then we also, and this discussion isn't happening, we need to penalize them financially as well when they over-censor, when they stop people's channels that then get proven to be right. We need to have it on both sides. We can't just have it at the front. It would need to be at the end, which is why I don't think it's workable. But ultimately, I think we need to teach people, and especially young people, about their own psychology. We might not need to teach them about algorithms specifically, to Laura's point, but we do need them to understand the business models that are ultimately manipulating them, and that the power of bad is ruling a lot of this, so that they can understand themselves better and their natural response to content, whether it's false or not. Ultimately, I guess my parting advice would be that we need to bring back nuance and critical thinking and make it sexy again. It's not fashionable.
Thank you.
Okay. We don't have a fake news problem. We have a fake news about fake news problem. Fake news doesn't have a fixed meaning. It has a fixed function, which is to restrict permissible public opinion and free-flowing information. And it does that in a way that serves powerful people and institutions and not the public. Misinformation is slippery to define. It's about as slippery to define as evil. So I would argue we need a lot less regulation. What we need is more transparency about how social media is working. We need more education and more debate. And like Bill, I'd say we don't need education about misinformation. What we need is education about critical thinking. We also need to trust people to decide for themselves what information they want to consume and how to interpret it. I know you had time to make up.
Thank you so much for so many fantastic questions, and sorry we're not going to be able to answer all of them. I think the note that I want to finish on is a point which binds us all together. It's those of us that are concerned about censorship, and also some of you who've asked questions. The lady asked about a question about real-world harm, and I think what binds us all together here is that we have a common concern that these civic networks that we all enjoy, sharing cat memes on or whatever, are going to go from these communications networks to being something more akin to a propaganda network. And whether you're worried about the spread of disinformation and fake news, or whether you're worried about the state's involvement in those networks, that is something that binds us together. So I would urge a note of caution. That is, the way to remedy this problem and this concern that these networks are becoming propaganda networks is most certainly not by giving them more power to police our speech, not by centralizing them further and not melding their power to the state.